want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hi, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host today, Rick Wilson. I am joined today by Noah Feldman. Noah is an attorney. He is a close observer of not only the role of American Jews in our history and our culture, but also has thought a lot about where we're going as a country with a meaningful Jewish population and our relationship with Israel, not only politically, but I think spiritually as well. And he's got a new book out that I was very interested to talk about. It's called To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. So Noah, talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book. And then I want to bridge and talk about some broader issues in the legal side, because that is really a lot of where you come out of in terms of your background in education and training.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for having me. As you said, I'm a lawyer. My day job is that I'm a professor of constitutional law at Harvard. And so I think a lot about how there's an interaction at all times between our values and how we operationalize those values in the real world in a space of conflict. And there's a point of real overlap with your themes, because you're always interested in understanding how different opposing points of view work themselves out with each other or fail to work themselves out. And the same sorts of issues that we think about in the US context are also operative within Israel, and they're also operative between the American Jewish community and Jews around the world and Israel. And so what I tried to do in this book is answer what I think is a real question, which is, if you're Jewish, why bother? Why bother to be Jewish? And if you're not Jewish, but you know people who are, or you're interested in Jewish issues in one way or another, either directly or indirectly, perhaps through your own religious faith, or perhaps through your political point of view, what should you make of the kinds of debates that are going on in the Jewish world today? And I'll just sum up what I had to say about that in a straightforward sentence, and it's that the Jews are a large, loving, and fairly dysfunctional family. And that is the best way to think about them.
Right.
And it's also a helpful way to think about them. And what I'm arguing for in the book is that Jews should not think of other Jews who have very different points of view on everything in the world as their enemies. Instead, they should think of them as cousins that they might be very mad at. And everyone who's ever lived in a family knows that the fact that someone's your family doesn't mean you're not mad at them. You could be really mad at them.
Very much so.
But nevertheless, to recognize that they're trying to come from a good place. And then I use that framework to try to explain a lot of the conflicts that you can sort of see today in the newspapers. You know, a conflict between a generation of Jews who were very bipartisan supporters of Israel, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, then a younger generation of Jews who are, many of whom are really angry at Israel from a progressive point of view. And that's been playing out within the Democratic Party. It's got direct relevance also for partisanship, because people like Donald Trump are out there saying, if you're a Jew, you ought to be a Trump voter.
Right.
And close to 70% of American Jews are Democrats, so they obviously don't agree with that. And so it's also, last but not least, connected to the kind of conflicts we've been seeing on American university campuses about the Gaza war, which often pit a generation of Jews, Gen X or younger boomer Jews in positions of authority, against Gen Z kids who are genuinely pained about Israel's policies and would like to see a change in the way that the U.S. government, whether it's Democratic or Republican, relates to Israel.
I'm curious. I want to bridge off of something you mentioned just now. Younger Jewish voters and younger Jewish Americans is part of what they're experiencing and watching what's unfolding in Gaza and with Israel's response to it. Is part of that emotion. I mean, I ascribe a lot of it to social media, but I also ascribe some of it to Israel's always existed for them. It's never felt like it was under existential threat for them. and for the generations after World War II, it felt like it was always, a country with a gun to its head, as someone once said to me. Is it? Are they missing the historical threat, and are we too far away from the lessons of the World War II lessons of the Holocaust and of the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel? Are they too far attenuated from it? Did they just not understand why Israel is there today?
I think about half of it is what you're describing. Intergenerational trauma is a real thing, and it's not like there aren't some younger Jews who can experience that trauma. And in Israel, they certainly do.
Yeah.
But it's also true that, as it gets harder and harder for a young person to have met more than one or two Holocaust survivors in their lives, it seems very far in the past. And the connection between the Holocaust and Israel seems tenuous because Israel is a successful state. It's kind of, in some sense, it's a victim of its own success.
Sure.
But then there's another half of it. And the other half of it is that, and this is a kind of subtle thing that people don't like to talk about, but it's important. For many, many American Jews, I would say, the great majority, their religious beliefs are bound up in their progressive democratic politics. If you ask them, what does being a Jew mean to you? They say, we're charged with repairing a broken world. There's a Hebrew phrase, tikkun olam, that goes alongside that. And they say that the Bible verse that inspires them is justice, justice shalt thou pursue. And for them, the content of being Jewish is pursuing social justice. Martin Luther King is a figure on a par with the great biblical prophets.
Sure.
And they look back nostalgically to the time when Jewish rabbis marched alongside King in the civil rights marches. So if those are your views, and you also grow up in a family that cares about Israel, and then you turn on the television, or more importantly, as you say, go on social media, and you see that Israel is engaged in policies that you as a young person think don't match your social justice progressive values, then your sense of anguish about that is much greater than it would be if it were just political, because it's political plus religious. And the reason we don't think of it that way, we don't think of young Jews as religiously motivated in their objection to Israel, because we tend to assume that only evangelicals are influenced in their politics by their religion. Whereas these folks are not evangelical at all. They're largely, not religious in the sense of Orthodox Jews, but they are Jews who still have beliefs. You can be a liberal Protestant and it could really mean something to you. You can be a liberal progressive Jew and it can really mean something to you. And so that's the other half of what's going on here.
Yeah, I think I think that's exactly right. I think that one of the points you made is they've always seen Israel as this economic success. They've always seen Israel as this relatively stable, relatively prosperous. Well, not relative for the neighborhood.
Extremely.
Other than the petrostates, they are extraordinarily prosperous. They have the most diversified economy in the region. They are, it does look as if Israel has everything it needs.
Yep.
I mean, and it is, folks, visit the neighborhood. It's not the best. It's not the best neighborhood in the world, but I do think it's interesting that dichotomy between American evangelicals and how their love of Israel is based on a certain prophetic belief in the end times and Israel's role in that, and a lot of American Jews who look at Israel as that sanctuary, but also that it should be an example of the behaviors of Tikkun Olam, that all the things that they should internalize from the desire to do good in the world.
Exactly. And they want Israel to be a light unto the nations, and then they'll be proud of it. But if they think, look, there's no Palestinian state, and if they blame Israel for that, which I think is a gross oversimplification, but right-wing Israeli politicians do play a role in that for sure, then it gets harder for them over generations to sustain the idea of Israel as a liberal democratic state, which is how Israel builds itself. It wants to be a technologically advanced market economy, liberal democracy. And there are genuine challenges to that within Israel. You have some parties in the Israeli government, in the Netanyahu government, that genuinely don't believe in that are genuinely Jewish supremacists. And that's pretty rough on younger generation of Jews. By the way, that's also hard on liberal democratic Jews in the Gen X generation, the Boomer generation, but they struggle with it, and they are not able to, or don't wish to, walk away from Israel over that. They say, well, maybe things will get better.
Well, I think Netanyahu has had this very defining role in the way he has played the game of Israeli politics for a generation now, essentially. More. And as folks know, full confession, I tried to help a center right, more secular candidate in 2021. Didn't work out. It ended up with the Gantz part of the coalition. Fine. He left this week. We'll see what happens. But Netanyahu has been a guy who, over time, has, at least from my outside perspective, become more contemptuous of the democracy part of Israel, even as he has exercised the power part very, very consistently and effectively to keep himself in a position of strength. But it feels like the democracy of Israel is straining at the seams with things like the decision about the courts and the discomfort with more moderate or secular folks with the power the religious parties have inside the government. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective on that, because I think the tension there, yes, it's wrapped up in Bibi, but it's also wrapped up in that decision. Are we going to have these religious parties define what Israel is? Or are we going to have a broader coalition define what Israel is?
Yeah, I think you gave a good assessment of it there. It's demonstrable that Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, has moved away from liberal democratic values because his coalition, with his full approval, introduced a bill that brought about half the country into the streets for 9 months. Yeah. And those protests only stopped because of the Gaza war.
That's right.
And the reason people were protesting it is that the bill was basically trying to change the way the Supreme Court could operate and make it harder for it to strike down laws that it thought of as violating basic principles of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not just me, who's a constitutional law professor, who thinks that was a bad idea. That's what a huge number of Israelis thought. And the people who objected were especially, not only, but especially more liberal, more democratically oriented, more high-tech folks, elite officers in the military, pilots in the Israeli Air Force,
Absolutely.
The people who, for better or worse, function as the elites within Israel. And they were worried that they all support a market economy. They were worried about the idea that the rule of law was going to break down because of this increasing encroachment of a kind of, Viktor Orban Hungary style,
right.
And, in some way also Trump-like, populist right wing who really cares about the courts. The courts are just part of the deep state.
Right.
And when it comes to elections, who really cares? Now, Netanyahu hasn't flouted elections. So to be clear, in that way, he's actually a little bit ahead of, maybe a lot ahead of Donald Trump.
Sure.
But he's triggered a lot of worry among Israelis just on the domestic questions of how Israel is governed. Now, we're not even talking in this context of the question of whether Israel can, in the long run, make peace with Palestinians and have two states side by side, which a lot of us still believe is the only actual solution to the situation there. Difficult as it is, hard as it is to get people on both sides to agree, it doesn't seem to me logically like there's any other way out of the problem. And young people on the right and the left tend to roll their eyes and say, oh, you're so old, you still believe in that kind of thing. But then you ask them, what's your solution? And they don't have a solution either. No. The ones on the Israeli right say, well, we'll just leave the Palestinians in a permanently subordinated, non-citizen, no voting state. And you say to them, did you see what happened on October 7? They're not going to put up with that. And then people on the left, or pro-Palestinian folks will say, well, we just need to have, a full democracy in the entirety of the land from the river to the sea, which is idealistically great. And it would be wonderful if they could get along. But as you mentioned, it's not a neighborhood where people get along so well with each other. Right. And right now, it doesn't seem like there's any realistic way to do that and sustain a functioning democracy that protects everybody's rights. So that's the quandary. And, this is as it's an old metaphor, but I think it's true. This is a married couple that badly needs a divorce. And it's not that divorces aren't incredibly difficult and painful. They are, but they also exist for a reason.
Yeah, it certainly. I mean, and I've watched how in the post-October 7th window, a lot of the ambitions that people had for a rapprochement that would look, and there's been a lot of progress in the neighborhood with Israel's relationship with the Emirates and in the Gulf states, and if Saudi, if the great grand bargain in the region of Israel and Saudi could come together. I think you might have other things that took some of the pressure economically and socially and politically out of the system. But right now, there are a lot of bad actors who benefit from no solution to this problem.
You're right. I mean, the Saudis,
Iran in particular.
Yeah, Iran in particular. I mean, one of the things that's so sad, but also in a slight way encouraging, so we don't sound completely pessimistic, is that Saudi Arabia really wants a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. They want it badly, and they're willing to make tremendous concessions to do it. Now, they're self-interested too. One of the reasons they want it is they want to lower the temperature in the region, and they also want to deal with the United States, where the United States will give them security guarantees similar to those that we give Israel. But in order to get there, they realize that the only path is a long-lasting, meaningful peace between Israel and Palestine. Yeah. And one of the reasons, not the only reason by any stretch, but one of the reasons that Hamas attacked Israel on October 7 is that they were worried that that deal might actually be in the offing, that it might be possible for such a deal to happen. And they wanted to make it a lot harder.
That's right.
Which serves their interest because they would be left out of any such deal. It would be the reasonable centrist Palestinians who would be in charge in the state of Palestine. It would not be, under the deal that everyone is contemplating, the much more extreme Hamas folks who believe that Israel should be destroyed altogether.
Right.
So they were trying to stop that from happening. And Iran also doesn't want that to happen because Iran doesn't want increased closeness between the Saudis, the United States, and Israel.
Correct. Well, we've solved all the problems in the Middle East now. I want to talk to you in your constitutional lawyer hat. Now, we are in a moment in this country where I think a lot of people correctly recognize that we've been banging around from one sort of constitutional crisis to the next for the last several years. And I think that the challenges to the Constitution that are on the horizon deserve more of an examination than we've given them. There's been a lot of superficial coverage about, is this court going to go too far to the right, too whatever. But talk to me a little bit about where you see the big inflection points, the big fault lines right now in sort of holding this constitutional republic together in the era of Trump and of the sort of extremely activist Leonard Leo idea of the courts.
Well, let me differentiate two things. There's the Leonard Leo Federalist Society view of what the Supreme Court should do. Mm-hmm. And the court has already done it.
Yes, pretty much.
I mean, we're not talking about some further set of decisions that could come. The wish list that the Federalist Society had was overturn Roe v. Wade. We got that. Put a definitive end to affirmative action. We got that. Weaken the voting rights laws to the point where states can essentially gerrymander things more or less however they want and pretend that they're doing it on purely political grounds, which is constitutional and lawful,
right?
And therefore hide anything that's racially based or that in some complicated way is both, because in lots of the South, almost all the black people who are in this given district will vote Democrat. And so if you want to gerrymander black people, you just say you're gerrymandering Democrats. Right. They got that too. So, gun rights, they got that. It's not like there's some big more cases
Chevron
on the agenda.
deference is like their last.
Right, and the court is going to do something with that this year. We don't know exactly what. The oral argument was a little equivocal. It looks like Roberts would like to basically just weaken Chevron deference, and the other conservatives would like to put an end to it, and who knows how that compromise will work out. Right. But the first thing I want to say is the judicial constitutional revolution on the conservative side is real. It has happened. Mm-hmm. And they've gotten what they wanted. So in that sense, Leonard Leo can retire from at least his, judicial hat joyfully, having achieved what he wanted to achieve. But there's another set of issues which are much scarier than even those very scary ones. Mm-hmm. And those are the issues about the basic legitimacy of our constitutional government. Right. And on those, so far, even this court, this, Federalist Society vetted revolutionary conservative court has done okay. I'm not giving out gold medals, but Donald Trump, who appointed 3 of the justices and claimed to have won the election, brought his claims not just to the people and the crazy people who invaded the Capitol, but he brought them to the Supreme Court first.
That's right.
And the Supreme Court said, no way, not on your life. And it wasn't close.
No.
And so, you might say, this is why I'm not giving any gold medals. They don't deserve, the Nobel Peace Prize for refusing to subvert our democracy.
Yeah.
However, it is worth noting that they refused to subvert our democracy, that part of their job is to stand up for the democratic system, and they did that. And so the real threat to our system is a world in which Trump is elected or disputes an election again, and once again tries to break the system. And there, he will go outside the courts. I mean, he'll try inside the courts too, but he knows he's not going to win that in the courts. So he'll go outside the courts the way he did on January 6th and the way that he thought about doing and didn't quite get to. For example, trying to deploy the military in some way, trying to cause Americans to have no faith in the functioning of our system, our constitutional system. Right. And that's the part that is a fundamental threat. And weirdly, and I know this is weird, Rick, and listeners will think it's weird, but I'm asking you guys to just try it on for size. Weirdly, our allies in preserving the democratic system and the rule of law there are the Trump judges. The ones who actually, very strangely, who actually so far believe in the rule of law, even though when it comes to constitutional decisions, they are consistently, in my view, completely out to lunch on their extreme conservative holdings. And out to lunch is a polite way of putting it. I think they're dead wrong on the meaning of the Constitution on all of these issues. But they so far still believe in the system. And why wouldn't they? The system is working out just fine for them.
There is a tension about the court that I've never seen in my lifetime. Even when Republicans and when the court had a much more liberal makeup in the 1970s and 80s, even when that was the case, and Republicans complained vociferously about the court's liberal bias, and the court was expanding government, the court was legislating from the bench, and the court was a liberal stalking horse. It strikes me that today the complaints about the court feel to me, at least, as if they have some greater sense of legitimacy. And I'll break this into two parts. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. The first area where it feels more legitimate, feels more tangible to me, is I think we are now seeing that the court has not governed itself on its ethics and integrity of the justices, particularly the situation with Clarence Thomas, to a lesser degree with Alito on the financial stuff. That to me seems like something that the court it's sort of a self-inflicted wound on the court. And the second part is the court's activism on some of these issues. We're starting to see, again, Alito to some degree, Thomas to some degree, in their publicly facing remarks, a greater comfort with being overtly more political or ideological than they were in the past. What do you think about those two areas of how the court moves forward when those two concerns have become, I think, much more embedded with the public than they ever have been before?
I'll address both of those, Rick, but let me just first add a third thing, which I think is actually the main thing, the elephant in the room. And that's their jurisprudence. The decisions they're making are killing their legitimacy, right? I mean, take Dobbs, which reversed Roe v. Wade. It has never happened before. Take it from me. I edit the leading constitutional law casebook. It's never happened before in the history of the Supreme Court that there was a fundamental constitutional right enjoyed by all Americans that was around for 50 years.
Right.
And the court said, nah, you don't have that right anymore.
Right.
That never happened before. So no wonder people are mad at the court. Now, let me talk about the statements and the kind of ethics problems. And here, I'm not going to say a word in defense of Justice Alito or Justice Thomas, who should have been much more careful. But I do want to add some historical context. In the old days that you were talking about, during the Johnson administration and especially the Nixon administration, when conservatives were up in arms at the court, they targeted, with some success, liberal members of the court on corruption-related matters. Abe Fortas was a justice who was nominated for Chief Justice, and he ended up resigning from the court in a cloud because of essentially taking money in a way that, not to influence the outcome of cases, but from a rich donor in a much greater degree than anything that Clarence Thomas took from Harlan Crow, like incomparably more money. And Abe Fortas was not an impoverished person who, had
Right.
worked only in government jobs his entire life and whose mother was living in, something not much better than a shack.
Wasn't it like $160,000 in $1960? That was real money.
Yeah, that was real money, and then there was Justice Douglas, and William O. Douglas is, a liberal lion.
Mm-hmm.
When he was on the bench, there was a major attempt to impeach him, led by none other than Gerald Ford, not some crazy far-right guy.
Mm-hmm.
It was partly because Douglas also took money from donors. Douglas was always impoverished because he was the first justice of the Supreme Court to get divorced, and then he was the second justice to get divorced, and then he was the third justice to get divorced. He married a fourth time, but didn't spend much time with his fourth wife because he had a yet younger wife, and each wife was younger than the one before. The final one, he was in his 70s, and she was barely 20. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And I would just add, the way that Douglas, the above-board way he dealt with that is he needed money desperately. He had, he had, count them, 3 alimonies, and
One's
he
enough.
wrote books. He wrote books. And what were those books about? A lot of them were about the environmental movement. He is one of the most important figures in the history of the American environmental movement. This is a political subject that came up in front of the court. And you know what happened when it came in front of the court? He did not recuse himself. No, he wrote the most aggressive and fascinating and exciting environmental opinions, usually on his own, of any justice ever. He famously wrote that trees and rivers should have standing to come into the court to protest their pollution or their destruction, which is, to environmentalists, still a very inspiring idea, though not one the court has ever adopted. So, and he didn't, so what I'm just trying to say is, seen in historical context, he was as partisan as he could have been. He never recused himself. He once famously, while on summer vacation, was approached by lawyers from the ACLU who asked him to issue an order stopping the bombing of Laos by the Nixon administration, and he issued the order.
I know the story. Yep.
And the Supreme Court then had to convene. It was the first time they ever held a hearing by telephone because it was the summer and they were all over the place. This was like pre-Zoom, obviously. And they held a hearing by telephone in order to overturn his order. So that makes Mrs. Alito's letting her freak flag fly seem honestly pretty mild by comparison. So, I'm not excusing Alito, who I think should recuse himself in the January 6 cases, though he's explained he's not going to. And I'm not accusing Justice Thomas, who should have been more careful. But I am saying this is not unprecedented. And the reason is when the court is doing things that are upsetting people, then everyone looks and says, your ethics aren't that good, or you're very liberal, or you're very conservative. And that's sort of part of so I agree with you, Rick, that it's felt, we feel it, but the reason we feel it is because of decisions like, the court striking down New York's very reasonable gun control law. And we just look at them and we're like, what the hell are you doing?
Right. I have to say there's a lot of, as we're recording this today on the 13th, there are a lot of people, because the court today basically gave conservatives a bit of a setback on mifepristone and pharmacologically induced abortion. And
Rick, it's not a small setback. It's not a small setback because if you think about it, in the real world, after the Dobbs decision, where nearly half of the states are now going to outlaw abortion or have outlawed abortion, some of them in incredibly draconian ways, the only way to mitigate that disaster is by sending people medication so that they're able to terminate pregnancies and sending that medication in many cases across state lines. And this was a case about that medication. So for the pro-life community, this is a big deal. Now, it's not like the court did it by saying it believes in abortion rights.
Correct.
It took the, in a sense, coward's way out. It said that the doctors who brought this case lacked the standing to bring it.
Right.
But it's still a more moderate result. And it fits what I was saying about the court having already won the big fights that the Federalist Society and conservatives wanted to win. Once they've won that, now they want to reestablish their legitimacy. They did everything they needed to do in a few years. Now they want to seem more moderate. And this is one step in that direction.
It does strike me that John Roberts is in a very difficult position as Chief Justice. He doesn't have the ability, either constitutionally or temperamentally, I guess, to really affect a lot of the behavior of the more conservative justices on the court. But he does seem to have a greater sense than a lot of the other conservatives on the court about trying to get the image of the court's legitimacy back into some kind of frame that isn't just conversations about Alito's flag or Clarence Thomas's RV and the ethical overhang. It feels like this case in particular felt to me like, just from my quick scan of it, like they were trying to go right up the middle on this, or at least pretend to go right up the middle on this one.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, the Chief Justice, you give a very good assessment of his situation. He loves the court as an institution profoundly.
Right.
And deep in his soul, he believes that the court should be more like an umpire and call balls and strikes and shouldn't take moral stances. Now, that sounds better than it is, because in reality, of course, the court always considers morality, whether the issue is abortion or affirmative action or gay marriage or what have you. You can't really decide these hard cases with no attention to morality. But Roberts' preference is never to have a headline that says Supreme Court overturns right X. He always wants technical opinions that just weaken those rights.
Right.
And so what he's been saying to conservatives this whole time is, you don't need to, you can make a revolution without calling it a revolution, and you won't get everyone so mad at you. And for a while, he had the power on the court to make those decisions look that way. But then when the Trump appointees came in, he lost that power. And now the court's conservatives are just like, we don't care, Chief Justice. We're going to do it our way. And so he's been trying to get them to see, we need to reel it in. And this is a classic sort of Roberts opinion. You use a technical judicial trick, namely saying that the people who brought the case weren't entitled to bring the case in the first place, even though the lower courts that consider it didn't think that. And then you make the case go away, and you never say, look, the FDA is in charge of these drugs, and it's up to the FDA to decide, and the court shouldn't stop that, which would have been a reasonable holding.
Sure.
And you never say, look, abortion rights are still meaningful, which they certainly don't believe. The majority certainly doesn't believe. But you still give a result that, although liberals won't be jumping up and down about it, in practice, it's way better than the alternative would have been. I mean, it's going to make an enormous difference to the long-term fight to enable especially poor young women who get pregnant in states where abortion is not available to still be able to have the lives that they want to choose.
And it had been the trend line that mifepristone was much more, not much more common, but increasingly a larger percentage of all abortions than the surgical options. So I think it's fascinating. One last question on the legal front: where do you see the question of immunity coming down from this court on Trump? And I mean, my argument has been they gave him a great gift by taking it late, and they're going to give him another gift by releasing it as late as they can. So it kind of put some of the federal cases on hold. Where do you see that decision coming down, and what do you think the impact is if they expand the amount of immunity sitting presidents have beyond where it is? I mean, there's some now on civil matters, but where do you see that case ending up as a matter of consequence for the country?
Well, they're not going to say that the president has absolute immunity for actions he performed while president that are criminal. They're not going to do that. The question is, what kind of partial immunity will they grant? And here, I just want to give an example that shows you that it's actually a kind of a tricky question.
Right.
Imagine that you like President Obama, and one of the things President Obama did when he was president is he authorized the drone strike that killed an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was living in Yemen at the time.
Right.
And he had opinions from within the Department of Justice saying he could do that. But it didn't go to the courts. Now imagine you're the next president, and maybe you're way to the left of Obama, or you're way to the right. And you say, you know what, we should bring a criminal charge against Obama for murder because he presided over the killing of an American citizen. Now, there are two possibilities, really, in the law. If you said absolute immunity, what that means is Obama doesn't have to go to trial and defend himself. He just hands in a piece of paper saying, I'm absolutely immune. This was conduct I did while I was president.
Right.
Or if you have qualified immunity, he goes into court, what's called qualified immunity. He goes into court and says, look, here were the legal bases that I rested on, and they were reasonable. And at that point, the court will say, if they were reasonable, we're throwing the case out. And if they were unreasonable, then we're going to hear the case. So that's really what we're talking about. What should happen in a situation like that? And the answer to that is not obvious,
Okay.
And so I think it's not crazy, in fact, for the court to decide something in between and to say it's some version of qualified immunity, which is the idea that if you had a reasonable basis for what you did, then they can't put you on trial. And if you didn't have a reasonable basis, then maybe you could be put on trial. And under that, Trump will eventually be put on trial, provided he's not elected. It won't be a win for Trump in the big picture.
Right.
You're right about the timing, of course. But that's also partly because of the timing of all this. I mean, we tend to forget that for the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, the Biden Department of Justice just hoped that Trump would disappear,
Right.
and they wouldn't have to charge him criminally at all. And the decision to go after him criminally came after the Congress January 6th report, and then people realized that Trump wasn't going anywhere, and suddenly we got Jack Smith appointed as a special counsel. That was pretty late. That was into 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the reason that the time crunch is happening is that this whole process started almost 2 years after, in retrospect, it should have started.
Well, it has been a fascinating conversation today, Noah Feldman. I appreciate you coming on the show today. Folks, Noah Feldman is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University, and specializes in constitutional law. It has been an absolutely fascinating insight into that and into Israel and American Jews. It's a conversation I wish we had more time for. But Noah, I appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you so very much. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
Thank you. Well, folks, I'm recording this on Friday, June the 14th. And yesterday, Donald Trump visited Capitol Hill. Now, look, I consider Donald Trump a man only in the very loosest of terms. Think about this guy. He lives a soft, coddled life. He's got a great dedication to makeup, hair care, and luxury products. And to say nothing for his total lack of manly virtues like integrity, honesty, honor, strength, courage. You name any of them, that he lacks them everywhere. But Trump does have one thing that he is truly dominant in, and that is forcing his political allies to humiliate themselves at his feet. He did that yesterday on Capitol Hill. And although every report of the event was like, oh my God, it was a disaster, he's crazy, he was saying the wildest shit, he was going to war with Taylor Swift, going to war with Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the whole thing. Somebody described it as like talking to your drunk uncle at the family reunion. They still bent the knee. Mitch McConnell, who hates Donald Trump, who hates him with the fire of a billion suns, still bent the knee. They all went out and they all kissed his ass, kissed the ring, kissed whatever, what the umber starfish. They love this guy in public. They all went and bowed down to him. A couple members got the hell out of town, but 99% of the Republican caucus was there. I just want to tell you guys, I want you to think about one event in time. In 1943, every Nazi still thought that Adolf Hitler was the greatest thing since prepared mustard, and they would never say a harsh word about him in public. But they also tried to kill him that year. And by 1946, they were all saying, Nazi, I was never a Nazi per se. This will be like that when it ends. You will all run from the humiliation you've inflicted upon yourselves in the end. You will all pretend you never liked him. You will all pretend you were never part of it. You will all pretend that you never bent down and put this country on the sacrificial altar before this man who would kill it. And that's it. And you're all on the enemies list.